The basics of decomposition and carbon fluxes can be understood from studying terrestrial systems. Carbon fluxes in streams are in many ways similar to those on land, but with a few unique aspects. The authors state that the horizontal flow of carbon in streams is similar to its vertical movement through the soil on land, but occurs over much larger distances. So what the authors are saying is that when you want to think of a stream and the processes that occur in a stream, think about a soil, and what happens is organic matter makes its way through soil. And many of the processes that occur in streams are very similar to soil, but the actors are slightly different. One of the main concepts associated with carbon fluxes in streams is the river continuum concept. And it integrates a number of aspects about streams: the size of the stream, the sources of energy, food webs, and nutrient processing into a longitudinal model of river metabolism. And here, the word longitudinal is associated with the patterns that occur along the length of a stream. This diagram represents the river continuum concept for a river system, and it's divided into different reaches. So first we have a headwater stream, and then a minor river, and lastly a major river. Headwater streams would be those streams that when streams essentially just start, and they're often underneath canopies of trees if it's a forested system. And what the river continuum concept represents, for example, are the types of actors that are playing. So headwater streams have first a unique source of carbon in that it's a relatively small reach where leaves and wood, for example, enter the stream. And there's sources of carbon that are unique in headwater streams compared to minor and major rivers. Headwater streams, because they're often shaded and there's a large input of carbon, don't have high GPP. So for headwater streams, GPP is low. There's not a lot of light there, and there's a lot of carbon input. With GPP relatively low, respiration is relatively high, and in that case, net ecosystem productivity is often less than zero. There's more respiration than there is production. So if you were to measure the carbon concentration, for example, in the water here versus here, you'd have more carbon in the initial portion of the reach than at the end of the reach. So we have a relatively low NEP, often negative, and net release of carbon. And then also most of the organic that enters is relatively coarse. So coarse particulate organic matter, which would be leaves or pieces of wood, for example, is often abbreviated as CPOM, coarse particulate organic matter. So here, for the headwater streams, they're shaded, there's a large input of carbon, there's more carbon that's released than is sequestered, net ecosystem productivity is less than zero, and it's dominated by coarse particulate organic matter. With high CPOM, the types of organisms that you find here are collectors and shredders with relatively few grazers and predators. As you move down the stream and get into the minor river, that stream opens up, and you can have much higher GPP in this system. As a consequence, net ecosystem productivity is sometimes even greater than zero. Production can be higher than respiration. Much of what was coarse particulate organic matter had become fragmented, and so that CPOM now becomes fine particulate organic matter, or FPOM. As a consequence, the balance of the different players changes. So shredders was relatively high when you had CPOM, but because you don't have much coarse organic matter, the proportion of shredders, those microfauna or macrofauna that take coarse particulate matter and chew it up, are relatively low. Collectors are about the same, but here you have a lot more grazers. And these are insects and other fauna that go through and actually graze bacteria or algae. Predators, slightly larger, but still about the same. So when we hit a minor river, NEP is sometimes greater than 0. We're going to have a lot more GPP, and what was dominated by coarse particulate organic matter is now dominated by fine particulate organic matter. As we work our way downstream now into a major river, by the time we're here, it's still dominated by FPOM, but net ecosystem productivity by now is often less than 0. The organisms that you find here, we don't have any shredders left, we don't really have grazers, and it's really just collectors and predators on the collectors. Large rivers accumulate considerable organic rich sediments, and the organisms here are filter feeders, and so they're going to be ones that go through and collect fine particulate organic matter from upriver, for example. So when we think about headwater streams, for example, we're going to think about systems, at least in forests, that are relatively well shaded, they're not very large, and we're going to have a lot of input of leaves, for example, as well as other coarse particulate organic matter. This is a system that also is going to be receiving a lot of water that's very enriched in CO2 or dissolved organic matter, and that leads to net efflux of CO2. On the other hand, by the time where those streams have come together, minor rivers have come together, and you have a major river, this is a system that has a lot of light, not a lot of input in carbon, and so you're going to have relatively high production in there, but also there's still a lot of flow of organic matter from upstream. And it's really a much different system by the time you're here. The river continuum concept really integrates headwater streams all the way down into those major rivers and thinks about how nutrients and organic matter cycle along that continuum. When we think about the specifics of decomposition for in streams and in rivers, that a lot of these processes are really very similar to what we have for soils. So the first component is that when you have a leaf that enters into the stream, for example, it's going to get wet and soluble components are going to be leached, but instead of going down into the soil, you have dissolved organic matter that enters into the water column. So you have mass loss from leaves through leaching, just like you do in soils. The next thing that happens is fragmentation. Microbes are going to colonize this leaf, and there's going to be physical abrasion, for example, that starts to remove particles and breaks it up. After that, we have invertebrates, insects, that go through, and they're going to start to chew on the leaf. This converts a lot of this material into particulate organic matter, often fine particulate organic matter. I think that's supposed to be an O in the end. So we have leaching at this early on. After that, we're going to have physical fragmentation, and then we're going to actually have microbial breakdown, just like we do in soils. This coarse particulate organic matter gets fine particulate organic matter, and we're going to have microbial conversion all along the way. Now, the pattern of mass loss can be a lot faster than what we'll see in many soils. Within a relatively short period of time, just like on land, 5 to 25% of the mass is lost due to leaching, and then in terms of days, within 100 days, half of that mass can be lost. And then it doesn't take long for the rest of it to be lost also. Another concept that is present in streams but not necessarily on land is the idea of spiraling. And so on land, when you have soils and you have a given unit of organic matter, that organic matter enters into the soil solution, then often stays relatively close if it enters the microbial body, for example. and doesn't make it too far. Now that organic matter can also move downwards, or soluble components of that organic matter can move downwards. It can be picked up and then brought to the surface by plants, for example, or it's lost out the bottom. In streams, there's something that's relatively analogous, but called something different, and that's spiraling. And that's the idea, is that you're going to have this constant flow of water. And nutrients and organic matter that can become soluble, once it becomes soluble, it tends to move downstream. And then it's going to get picked up by microbes, for example. It might be processed some more, and then it's released, and it moves downstream, and then it might be picked up again. So you have a situation where you have the equivalent of spirals that happen, where it's released and then it's picked up, released and picked up. And we can think about the length of individual spirals that are based on how fast the flow is, but also how long it takes for microbes and other organisms to pick up soluble material. And so the unit, you might have a given amount of length between pickups that are here, but in some systems you might have more frequent pickups, and that causes the spiraling length to be a lot less. Now typically for organic matter in rivers, organic matter is going to travel on the order of 10 to 100 kilometers before it's broken down and lost by respiration. So you have organic matter that enters into the stream, and it might spiral, but by the time a given unit has been respired, it often will have traveled 10 to 100 kilometers before it's broken down and respired. So when we think about streams, one of the most important things to consider is really that there's a continuum of environments, and organic matter sources change as you move downstream. So we go from places that are relatively shady when you have your stream, and then by the time that stream is large, they're relatively sunny. In addition, we're going to have a source of organic matter that's primarily terrestrial when you're in the headwaters, but by the time you're here, it's primarily going to be production from within the stream. So the environment changes as you work your way down the stream and into rivers, and the sources of organic matter change also.